Hi there, this is Josh from Literary Gladiators, and today I'm here to talk about a short story. And the short story that I'm going to be talking about is called Up in Michigan by Ernest Hemingway. And it can be found in the short stories of Ernest Hemingway, and is the earliest entry within this collection. Up in Michigan is a very controversial work in the way that it goes over some very touchy subject matter. But Hemingway being Hemingway, he approaches it the way that he approaches many of his other works. And it is the beginning of an ongoing theme as far as the way that he writes men and women are concerned. But a basic summary of this short story is that it's 6 pages long, and it pertains to a blacksmith by the name of Jim Gilmore, who is residing in Hortons Bay, in Michigan, right on the border of Canada. This is a very modest town, as it's being described. It has his blacksmith shop, a general store, a post office, a Methodist church, a school, and so many houses. And Jim takes his meals from Mr. and Mrs. Smith, DJ Smith and his wife, who is merely referred to as Mrs. Smith. And someone that works for Mr. and Mrs. Smith is a young woman by the name of Liz Coates. Liz Coates is infatuated and has an admiration for Jim Gilmore, but he does not feel the same about her. And she spends all of her waking moments thinking of him. He doesn't even... He barely acknowledges her. If she says something to him, he just acknowledges, he just sees her as any other stranger. He goes deer hunting one time. She continues to think of him. After he comes back from deer hunting, he's happy to be home, and he ends up getting drunk on whiskey. After a major meal, he begins to feel that he needs to be sexually fulfilled. And he sees Liz on his way out. She makes it so that she can catch a glimpse of him as he leaves. And he finally does approach her. And she is excited, but at the same time frightened. And he ends up becoming physical with her in the touchy-feely sense, and then he says, "Come on for a walk," and he brings her to a warehouse on the dock, and he essentially rapes her. And it really has an altering effect on her. On my first read, I felt that it pertained to the dark underbellies within simple rural towns and the demons that may present themselves among ordinary people. And that a beautiful, innocent girl like Liz Coates is being taken advantage of by someone that is revered within the town. Someone like Jim Gilmore. But on my second and subsequent reads, it just read like any other Hemingway work. He shows no understanding for females, and feels that their lives are pretty much wrapped around males. The way that he writes them, it's just very exterior. There's not really much of a not much of a psyche, but not much of an effort to understand female characters. The way that he describes them, you want to compare the two, and I think that the way that I think that the imagery within this piece is very strong. And even the things that aren't directly descriptive, one can definitely analyze it and either come up with or create their own implications. But the way that he describes Jim, as per page 81, and I quote, that he is short and dark, with big mustaches and big hands. He was a good horseshoer and did not look much like a blacksmith, even with his leather apron on. Whereas he describes Liz as, according to Mrs. Smith, and as per page 81, the neatest girl she'd ever seen. And in addition, he makes mention of the fact that she had good legs and always wore clean gingham aprons, and Jim noticed that her hair was always neat behind. He liked her face because it was so jolly. Jim is defined by his abilities, that his physical appearance really doesn't matter, but that he is a very able person and a very important person that plays an important role within the community. Whereas Liz is defined by her appearance. She's defined by her beauty and her ability to be clean and neat and beautiful. It very much defines the way that gender roles took place within this period of time. The period of time I am very much projecting was 1884 because Jim makes reference to discussion that he had with Mr. Smith. He was referred to as DJ Smith. They discussed James Blaine. James Blaine was the Republican nominee for the presidency in 1884, who lost to Grover Cleveland. And this is Cleveland's first term. I would agree that this short story created the layout of Hemingway's other works, especially when it came to works that pertain to women. Probably the most noteworthy example is Hills Like White Elephants. He does make mention to a female character in The Snows of Kilimanjaro. There are female characters in Soldier's Home, but that one more so concentrates on the... It concentrates more on PTSD. And then you have The Short Happy Life of Francis McCumber, where they also have a bit of a wonky role. The rape scene within this piece brings up the debate as to the topic of consent. Liz constantly makes mention of the fact that she's not comfortable in the verbal sense, but there's something within her that's desiring and wanting more as far as her encounter with Jim is concerned. As per page 85, it said, and I quote, "The boards were hard. Jim had her dress up and was trying to do something to her. She was frightened, but she wanted it. She had to have it, but it frightened her." There are two things to keep in mind within this piece and at this moment. Liz is inexperienced, and Jim is intoxicated. Neither one of them knows what's going on, and Liz is in an uncomfortable situation. She should not be in this situation. She walked into a bad situation and was taken advantage of it as a result. In conclusion, Jim was not really in love with her. He was just looking for his fix. He didn't see her as a woman that wanted to be loved, but as an object of desire that was going to give him his fix. Liz was the perfect target for him because she was naive, she was fixated on him as it was. She was in the place that she was at the time that he was looking for someone. But not for love, but for sex. And the way that Hemingway wrote her, she existed just to be taken advantage of by him. It's definitely a travesty that she went through what she did. And it is a travesty that she was taken advantage of. The discussion about consent is, if somebody says no, does no mean no? And does yes mean yes? There should be a greater understanding and a greater sense of communication as far as what one's limits are. Jim was incapable of understanding because he was intoxicated, and all he cared about was getting what he wanted. The red flag, as far as him being intoxicated is concerned, can be found on page 84. In this particular paragraph, upon him returning from deer hunting, Jim began to feel great. He loved the taste and the feel of whiskey. He was glad to be back to a comfortable bed and warm food and the shop. He had another drink. Jim began to feel great, number one. Number two, he loved the taste and the feel of whiskey. Number three, he had another drink. So he was clearly intoxicated and drunk. He felt great. When you feel whiskey, that means you're drunk. And when you have another drink, you're more drunk than you were before. Especially when the period of time is so close to the drink before. If you have two drinks close to one another in a row, it's not like it's not like your intoxication subsides itself very quickly. Granted, it may take him longer, but he was already feeling the whiskey, so he was already feeling drunk. So he only became more drunk. That's a red flag. That's a red flag to us, the reader. But Liz was just so infatuated, and the way that she saw him, she saw that she didn't see him the way that we saw him. He could not do any wrong. It was almost as if Percy Sledge wrote a song about when a woman loves a man, rather than when a man loves a woman. While he was going deer hunting, she was obsessed with him, as per page 82. All the time Jim was gone, on the deer hunting trip, Liz thought about him. It was awful while he was gone. She couldn't sleep well from thinking about him, but she discovered it was fun to think about him too. That's a sign of infatuation, when you're very much thinking about somebody and different moments and scenarios and creating memories that have never happened. And when it comes to certain infatuations, would never happen. But it gets to the point where she doesn't think she could, these thoughts and then the dreams combined with one another, because she just grew tired and passed out. But when you mix the two together, there's trouble that will subside. And then when she encountered him after the dinner, and he started touching her and said that, let's go for a walk. She's walking into trouble. On the physical sense, she was very, aside from what she was thinking, in the physical sense, she was feeling turned on. But she's young, innocent, and naive, and is not so much aware. As per page 84, I quote, "Her breasts felt plump and firm, and the nipples were erect under his hands." This was as he was feeling her at first. Liz was terribly frightened. No one had ever touched her, but she thought, "He's come to me finally. He's really come." She's not putting the two together at that moment. She feels that the fact that he's there and he's finally acknowledged her, this must be what it's like. Maybe it does feel uncomfortable. It's an abusive situation, and but she has not noticed that yet. It's abusive in the way that he really doesn't care for her. It just means that he's drunk and that he's looking for his fix. Her physical reaction was out of impulse, but her mental reaction was based on the way that he approached her. And up until then, she didn't know what it meant to be touched in that way. It's always very haunting, the way that rape is described, and that the way that, especially the way that one can describe it without actually referring to it directly. One of the most powerful examples is in A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams, where they just refer to an action that takes place, a musical action, and they insert it to particular actions within the piece, and then when it's applied into the 10th act, when Stanley rapes Blanche, that is depicted on the basis of how it was used before. Before, it was used between couples, whether it was based off of a mutual decision or based off of something that it was just a sexual encounter between husband and wife or between partners. In this sense, it was clearly unwelcome. But it constantly makes mention to the feeling of the hard wood and the pain that comes with the touching against their will. Probably the line that stuck with me the most was on page 85 that said, and I quote, "The hemlock planks of the dock were hard and splintery and cold, and Jim was heavy on her, and he had hurt her." Liz was in a painful situation, and we too could feel her pain as far as the what had physically happened is concerned. And the word splintery speaks wonders, because these actions are sticking into her like the pieces of wood that make up the splinters. And the only difference is that it's easier to remove the splinters. It may take some, you might have to get some tweezers, and it may feel, you'll feel a pinch as you pull it out, and it may feel a bit sore a little bit after. But it's easier to remove than the mental aspects of what happened and what took place in that warehouse on the dock. But just what had happened, it was the way that he had inserted himself into her like they were splinters, and the way that he, probably the way that he clawed at her, because the way that he touched her, it was in a more, it was in a rough way. It wasn't like he was feeling her. It wasn't like he was just, it wasn't like he was rubbing. It was squeezing. But the situation goes from, as per page 85, she goes from being hot all over from being with Jim, despite the cold weather, to being cold and miserable, and everything felt gone. This was where she lost her innocence, both physically and mentally. And it went from hot to cold so quickly. It went from, there was this sense of love and life and living, to coldness and desolation and meaninglessness. And that is depicted in the fact that Jim just passed out drunk. It went to show that he didn't love her. It was the fact that he was just taking advantage. The very last line within this text is, and I quote, as per page 86, "A cold mist was coming up through the woods from the bay." This was happening as she was walking away from the dock. And this is a natural reminder to the fact that on top of Liz's cold feelings, that she will not be perceived in the same way. And that there was no genuine magic. She thought that he was her knight in shining armor when he was merely a selfish, advantageous bum. And if something were to come out, she would be the one that would be shunned. Jim would likely continue to be revered. There's also that possibility that they may be forced into a miserable marriage with one another. That he pretty much inflicts advantage onto her. But I think that any given way that this is it's a very sad piece, and it's a very miserable piece, because it depicts the wrongs that take place in society. But is this Hemingway's commentary on the roles of men and women within society? Nah. It's just an early example of the way that he writes about men and women. Because Liz's character is probably the prototype of the way that Hemingway would write women as his career progressed. Up in Michigan is a piece that it's worth examining, because there's a lot that comes out of it, and a lot that people can take out of it. It was a piece that was very well written, but it is a Hemingway piece, and one can take the message out of what Hemingway is conveying, and Hemingway may be saying something, but you still have to see Hemingway for Hemingway. But I think that everybody can agree that what happened was not acceptable. And what happened to Liz was absolutely wrong. If you want to check this out and Hemingway's other short stories, here's the collection that I acquired from Second Time Books in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. This is my go-to when it comes to reading Hemingway short stories. Thank you for tuning into this video. I hope you check out some more videos from our channel. And we have a lot of discussions about works, short stories, and other works. Some of them are individual, others are group discussions. If you like what you see on this channel, please subscribe, because you'll get a lot from my fellow contributors and I. If you really, really like what you see, please support us on our Patreon, for the money that we make will allow us to provide you, the viewer, with even more great content. For now, and as always, I encourage you to keep reading.